Hi, and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. That's what I do on my channel. And then today we have Dr. Josh Rasmussen and Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic, as he's more popularly known online. And we're talking about theism, atheism, and overcoming bias. We don't have a whole, a set things of what we want to talk about, but I'm anticipating a very good discussion just on atheism and theism and bias in general, how to overcome it. Both of these guys, I've seen in their work how they've interacted with bias and tried to overcome it in their own ways, and so it's going to be a really good and helpful discussion. Well, let's do this first. So Josh, for anyone who doesn't know who Josh is, he has a YouTube channel called Worldview Design, where he's posted actually a good number of videos. How many is it right now? You had like a 20-part series, and you're in the middle of another series. How many videos do you have right now?
40 or 50 or so.
That's pretty
good.
It's
in the works. Yep.
Yeah. Well, you have you just crossed the thousand subscriber mark, so you're on your way. You're growing and growing. I mean, neither one of us is anywhere near where Alex is right now, but we'll get to Alex in a moment. Josh, take about 30, 60 seconds and inform the audience a little bit more about who you are.
Sure. Well, when you say we'll get to Alex, you don't mean that we're going to get to his subscriber list and then exceed it by a lot. Is that you mean?
Oh, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Of course. So yeah, I am a professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University, and my areas of specialization would be sort of on the foundation of things like fundamental ontology, foundation of minds, and today we'll be talking about maybe tips and tools for how to get to knowledge, which is another area of interest. And then I tend to apply my inquiries to kind of the big questions that people think about. Like, is fundamental reality purposeful? Is it a mind in some sense? Does your life have meaning? What does that even mean to have meaning? And those questions kind of give my work application. So that's what I'm about.
Cool. I switched my scene too late. You just stopped talking and I put it up there. All right, well, let's get to you, Alex. You've been on the show a bunch, and we had a great discussion on the contingency argument on the Unbelievable show. Has it been a year since we did that? Has it been over a year? I don't even remember.
It must have been, yes, because I'm working on a video that actually will reference that debate, and I'm pretty sure it was like maybe a year and a half or so ago, actually.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's been a while, but it was a great discussion. I loved having it with you, and I'm very honored that you'd come back on the show to have this dialogue with Josh. We'll take same amount of time and just inform everyone who you are if they don't know, and then we'll get into some dialogue.
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks for having me back again. Everyone always says at the end of a discussion, this has been great, thanks for coming on, but the real test is whether they invite you back on the show again, which I'm glad to see that you've done. I am the same person I was the last time I was on the show, so for any new viewers, my name is Alex. I am a YouTuber who doesn't exactly have a level of expertise in anything he talks about. I'm currently studying to hopefully get that kind of expertise once I finish my degree in philosophy and theology. But for now, my experience is one of just making content online and being in a position where, as I say, I don't necessarily have an expertise in what I'm saying, but I do have a lot of experience in terms of mind changing, not just changing other people's minds, but my own mind changing as well. Most drastically was my conversion to veganism, if you can phrase it in that terminology. When that happened, it was so out of left field for me. I remember watching, I think it was Lawrence Krauss a few years ago, saying something like, look, when you go to university, I want something that you really cherish and believe strongly to just be torn away from you, because that's part of kind of growing up. And I thought, yeah, I'm sure that will happen to me. And I was wondering, would it be my view of the origin of the universe? Would it be my view about God? Would it be my meta-ethics? I never would have expected that it would have been my diet. And my ethics towards animals. And so it just showed to me that you can never know where changes of mind are going to come from. But it also kind of gives me an experience of knowing what it takes to change my mind, knowing what other people have told me in terms of my content has changed their minds, and knowing what can get in the way of changing mind. And usually the thing that gets in the way the most is bias.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue into, I've noticed lately on your channel, in particular, Alex, you've said that you don't necessarily endorse some of the things that you said in your previous videos. You've, like you said, you followed the evidence, and now you're a vegan, and you've critiqued people in your own camp. I saw your video on Christopher Hitchins. And so what I'm seeing from you is basically that you're exemplifying these intellectual virtues. And so it'd be good to talk about like what's behind that. Like, why do you find yourself wanting to do that?
Well, it's kind of you to put it like that. I think that the main thing is to note that like it shouldn't be something particularly praiseworthy to be willing to criticize people on your own camp, as you say. I mean, I think it's a useful tool to actually getting to the truth. I mean, I adore Christopher Hitchins. In fact, I think just in shot here you can see this saint-style candle that I got from Etsy of the man. You know, I really do enjoy his work and his writing, and I'm a big fan. But I kind of recognize, reading his work, that he would want to be criticized, right? That's kind of what he got off on. He got off on people kind of telling him why they thought he was wrong, and obviously he enjoyed responding, which he can't do now anymore. But I realized that that's actually what he would have wanted, and so that's kind of one of the first indicators of why we should be doing this, because it's not going to harm anybody. But then once you partake in it, you realize not only are you able to be taken more seriously, like if I said to you, Cameron, or to you, Josh, that, you know, oh, Christopher Hitchins is great on this point, you might think, look, he's another one of those atheists who just love Christopher Hitchins and listen to everything he says, but so much of what Hitchins says is ridiculous, and he's probably been blinded by his eloquence. But now the chances are you might take me more seriously because you know that I've criticized Hitchins on things that I don't think he's right about. So there's kind of more reliability, I think, in my praise of what he does get right. And so in many ways it's a respect to the person as well, because if somebody I know has criticized me a lot and has told me where they think I'm wrong, then it means all that much more when they tell me that they think I'm right, because I recognize that they're really kind of focusing on the arguments. But I don't know. I mean, coming into contact with people is the main thing that changed my attitude towards this, or allowed me to realize how much I may have got wrong. You know, when I went to university and I started a society with some friends, a debate society that's made up principally of kind of half Christians and half atheists, and we get together and debate things. I mean, I was debating with serious academic friends who were presenting ideas to me that I'd never come across before. And I just realized there's so much more to this than you realize just being in a kind of YouTube bubble of edgy atheism. And it made me realize that if I'm going to do this, I want to do it properly. So I just decided to take things a bit more seriously.
Josh, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can relate to that. I mean, I appreciate how it kind of shows that you're wanting to widen your audience so that you're not just speaking to the choir or to an existing camp. And this is something that I've noticed is very rare and hard to do. For people, it seems like people mostly are kind of reinforcing their original tribe or their original camp. And that when you want to reach a wider audience, you got to actually see, okay, what are the best forms of another position? And I like what you said about if you can show even a critique of people who might agree with you on maybe some big questions, but you don't agree with maybe a particular line of thought, I think what that shows is that you really want to get to the truth. Like, you're not just trying to reinforce an existing tribe or an existing camp. And I actually wrote down sort of a set of strategies for how, in my experience, it seems like people make more progress on their journeys, you know, because we're all on a journey. There's like infinitely many things to discover, and there's infinitely many false beliefs to be unlocked and weeded out of your mind, you know, that you could have. And it looks like one of them is just exactly what you're saying, where you're looking at a topic from different perspectives and seeing how certain lines that might lead to a conclusion that you think is true, that those lines actually aren't good lines, and pointing those out. So I can definitely relate to that, for sure.
I wanted to get back to Christopher Hitchins for a second. Have people told you that you're like the Hitchins reincarnate? Have you heard that from anybody?
One or two people have kind of noted a comparison in one way or another, and depending on who it comes from, that can either be a compliment or an insult. So I always kind of like to give them the benefit of the doubt. I was just going to follow that up with it. What do you take that as a compliment, or is it more of an insult? Or, I guess it depends on the context, situation, who's saying it. Well, yeah, I think it's undeniable that the person who's had the most influence in terms of the way that certainly the way I write, and probably the way I speak as well, has been him. Just in terms of not necessarily even the content, but kind of I spent so much time listening to what he had to say because I was just so into. I went through the phase that most young atheists go through, and just kind of the style of speaking I noticed I began to kind of pick up on, and I started to kind of I really wanted to understand what it was about him that people loved, because nobody denies that he's, they always say about his eloquence and things, but I was like, what is it really that gives him that? And I started picking up on little clues. For instance, I figured it out, I'm pretty sure, why no one could ever interrupt him. I realized this not too long ago. He would do this thing where he would attach the last word of a sentence not to the sentence, but to the beginning of the next one, and that's how you never get in, because there'd never be a point for you to jump in. He'd say something like, and I just think it's an absolute disgrace. And furthermore, that kind of thing, right? Like the word disgrace would be attached onto the next thing, and the break would be just in the middle. And so you never get the chance to jump in. And it was little things like that. And I was thinking, man, this is interesting.
Do you think that was like planned? Do you think, or is that just kind of like naturally what happened to him? And that's, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he's doing it on purpose, but I think that we can kind of, a lot of people, so someone like Hitchins was quite clearly just naturally rhetorically gifted. And so although he didn't choose to do it, if you figure out what it is about his kind of natural way of speaking that was so eloquent, you can then replicate that on purpose. So even though he wasn't doing it on purpose, we could do it on purpose if we wanted to replicate that kind of thing. But the difficulty is, that I began to realize, is that certainly a few years ago when I was really into Christopher Hitchens, he was so eloquent and so witty and so funny that he probably could have convinced me that the earth was flat. It really didn't matter what he was saying. The fact that it was him saying it was enough for me to take it seriously. I hear from a lot of atheists who say that when they're not sure what to think about on an issue, they kind of go to Christopher Hitchens, right? That's kind of where they start, because they're pretty sure that he'll have it right because they agree with so much of what he has to say. That was the danger that I first kind of picked up on. And we were talking just before we went on air about this talk I gave in Los Angeles a few years ago that you saw, Josh. And I remember saying in that talk, because the talk was about why smart people believe silly things. And this is one of the first points that I think is really important to stress here, is that people who are intelligent and gifted and rhetorically, sublime, people like Hitchens, they're actually, it's not like they're in a better place to be shielded from bad beliefs and bias. They're in a better place for it, right? They're more likely to be susceptible for it because they're better at rationalizing the positions they have. So if they have a really bad position, they're better at rationalizing it. Now, with Hitchens, the obvious example that people will go to is something like the Iraq War. Many people who otherwise love Hitchens think he was utterly wrong on that. But if you watch the debates, it's hard not to be convinced because he's being so eloquent and amazing. And yet when you come away from it, you think, but he's wrong. Like he's wrong about this. I know he's wrong, but you can't quite figure out why. And that's a good exercise in recognizing that just because it's a good speech doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Yeah, sometimes I think that just connecting to that point, that philosophers who, I think Jonathan Haidt talks about philosophers having high cognitive needs because we want to sort of see the rational lines, even if it goes against like what any normal person would find plausible. If we can't see the principles, we can't see the rational lines, it kind of upsets us. And so this can lead us to views I think most people would consider pretty crazy, like just eliminating consciousness or eliminating people altogether. Like there are no people, And it's fascinating to me to see that. And then also for myself, just thinking about beliefs maybe that I would reject or have. And I have to check like, okay, do I have a sort of emotional interest in this? And this is related to one of the things that I think is kind of an anecdote, because what I hear you saying, Alex, is that there's a kind of problem, which is that if you're really intelligent, you can use your mind to spin webs of reason around almost like a cherished belief, and it protects that belief. And people can come along and try to unlock that belief from the web, the rational web, using other rational webs. But then you could just add more web around. It's almost like it becomes this endless thing. And what I've seen as being, I would say, the best anecdote and the only anecdote is to really pay attention to what it is that you're desiring. Like, what are you aiming for? And I say you, but I mean, this is like a sermon for myself to really pay attention to that. Like, what do I want? And if I notice that what I'm wanting to do is to protect a certain belief, then and this can change across the day. It can change across even looking at a single argument. But if instead I'm saying, okay, I really want to face reality. Like I want, like everybody has different beliefs. Maybe I was raised with a certain belief, but like I really want to get to the truth. And I'm actually kind of curious to ask you, Alex, like in those conversations at the university, what was something that was kind of new or unexpected in terms of there being maybe more complexity?
The first example that springs to mind, just because I tweeted about it the other day, is the ontological argument. There's a friend of mine, his name's Ryan, who I've spoken to about it the most. He's kind of quite into the argument, and I remember
is he
kind
a
of the first
Christian or
time
atheist?
he's a Christian, and we met at the debate that Steve Woodford did with Justin Brierley. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's where we first met anyway. That's how this society I mentioned earlier started, actually. We went to this society, to this debate, and afterwards the Christians and the atheists, because it was a debate, were together in the pub, and then the pub closed, and then I invited people back to my room, and I had basically the whole Oxford Christian Union in my room just debating until 4 a.m. And then we just made it a society. And Ryan is actually the co-president. And we kind of discuss the ontological argument. We did so recently just before the lockdown, kind of walking 2 meters apart. And I just remember kind of thinking, like, because the only time I'd really properly at length engaged with a Christian on a specific argument in other circumstances was in debates, right? And although everybody says that they are that they're open and willing in a debate, it's like, look, there are people watching, right? You don't want to embarrass yourself. I mean, and this is something I will never deny. Like that is always going to be on your mind, no matter what. You're never going to really just think out loud or just try a stupid idea only 5 seconds later to go, no, I guess that doesn't work. But like, this is what we'd be able to do in our discussions. So we'd kind of, we would just talk it out. And I'd say, because he really likes Plantinga's version of the ontological argument. And I'd say, well, you can't say that, it's possible that God exists, because that doesn't make any sense, because you are kind of just, then you're just saying that God does exist in all possible worlds. You're just assuming the conclusion. And he's kind of like, yeah, that's the point. That's exactly the point, is that when you accept the first thing, it leads you to the second. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that actually does make sense. And so I kind of take that back. And then we discuss, but what about the idea that if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then he can't exist in any possible. And we're kind of discussing this. And instead of it being like, look, I here's the flaw in your reasoning, this is why I disagree with you. It's like an actual question, because I'd frame it as like, but hold on, don't you like, doesn't the same thing go the other way?
Yes.
Right? And before you know it, you're having a really interesting, useful conversation about modal logic. And that kind of thing just wouldn't happen in a public forum, and probably wouldn't have happened if I went into the conversation wanting to prove a point rather than being genuinely interested in the position that he holds, So that's kind of one of the main examples that I can think of. But it's been mainly kind of little things, or like in tutorials, when I have to write an essay for a tutor. Even just today, I had my first online, because term has started now. I had my first online, and I'd written this essay about why death isn't bad for the person who dies. And my tutor just kind of goes, this bit's circular, right? Your reasoning is totally circular. And I just took one look at it and went, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, these things are happening all the time. It's just not something that really happens in public debate enough.
Yeah, this really touches on something that I've noticed too, which is that in the academic sphere, there's a different kind of conversation that I feel like is happening, not just like in small groups outside of class, but also even in the journals, the kind of back and forth between the authors and these technical journals. To me, it feels like there's kind of this big team with many different eyes and many different viewpoints. And, it's not that we're all like 100% in harmony, and just love each other or whatever. But there's a feeling of respect and growth, and there are certain rules of the game that make ideas kind of flow more effectively. So, like, for example, one of the rules that I discovered is not sort of universally followed outside of this sort of narrow academic game, is that if you're going to say something that you think is true, you're going to try to say what you think your audience would resonate with, rather than, and if you think something is true and you don't think your audience will resonate with that, then what the philosopher does is they'll say something like, well, it seems to me that such and such. because at least then the audience can resonate with the fact that at least it seems to that person that such and such. And I find that actually that's very helpful for kind of removing distractions, because it kind of helps us to focus on, okay, what are the lines to explore? Now we're kind of like exploring the lines, and there's a lot of progress that can be made, that it seems like there's barriers in the popular sphere. However, I've been learning as I've moved more into the popular sphere that there's a kind of psychological intensity that I think is extremely valuable, and that also helps to focus your attention on kind of like what matters the most, or kind of what the places are that, and get things simpler so we can really think about it. And I don't mean simpler in a kind of derogatory way. I mean, like, let's focus on this. Whereas I think like academics, we almost like lose sight of that. And so I don't know, I've actually been thinking a lot lately about how these two worlds, the sort of academic world and the more popular world, could come together in a way that kind of brings the riches of both. And maybe even these kinds of conversations are part of that project, that Cameron hosts these people who are kind of working behind the scenes, but then also coming into the popular sphere. Because I mean, I can tell you in my own journey, it's like I was telling my wife, Rachel, it seems like every single topic I've looked into, I've changed my mind about. And I'm not just like saying that this isn't like just like a virtue signal or whatever. Like, I mean, when I started looking at, are there abstract objects? I was a skeptic. And then the arguments convinced me. When I was looking at, debates on consciousness, it's like arguments convinced me and moved me. And a lot of it isn't even just like being moved onto another side of a fence. It's like you see, there's actually like 12 fences there, and this fence goes this way, and you can actually come over here. I didn't even see that was a possibility. You mentioned the ontological arguments. I mean, people sort of think there's this argument, the ontological argument, because the word "the" comes right before it. And then they think of Anselm, and then maybe they'll think of Plantinga's modal version. But then people are often unaware of the developments in the Gödelian line of ontological arguments and strategies for breaking the symmetry between the possibility of theism versus the possibility of no theism. And, are any of those successful? Well, it's hard to just sort of see that through one line or in a debate context where there's war going on, but you almost have to slow it down to actually investigate the lines and just see, and that's part of, I think, what makes philosophy very interesting, because, and science, I mean, just truth seeking in general, it's because there's always more to see.
Yeah,
I want to say
those
this
questions
real quick.
Wouldn't even come up.
Let me jump in real quick. We're gonna do some Q&A in about half an hour. So I see a few people are already starting to send in some super chats and are starting to ask questions. We are going to do Q&A, and we're trying to do Q&A for most of the time today. So we'll get to those in about half an hour. We're just going to, again, this is just super informal dialogue about bias, overcoming bias, and how we can do better, and critical thinking and all that. So we'll talk for another 30 minutes or so, and then we'll do some Q&A. So just wanted to give you guys a heads up. So if you have a question, you can post it right now if you want to, but I probably won't be looking at them until I announce it. So Alex, feel free to pick up where you were.
I was just going to say, I mean, you never even get to the questions. Like, you say, like, you want to have an interesting discussion about how to break the symmetry between the possibility or the impossibility of God. It's like, that question wouldn't even come up if the barriers have already gone up at the first instance, not realizing that there are different kinds of arguments. It's not like you can't kind of have that discussion. It's like the discussion doesn't even come onto the table. It's just, as you say, it's got to be a case of people having more long-form discussions. I mean, I am a fan of debates. I take part in debates. I see them as entertainment in many ways. I think they're fun to take part in, but I've just come to realize that they're just not an effective mode of communication. I've been working on doing some debate reviews from some debates that I've done in the past, and just breaking down like a 10-second clip of someone saying, and just thinking it's going to take like 15 minutes of explication just to explain what the problem is here, and it's a shame. And the worst part about it is it made me realize exactly what you were saying, or a problem, I should say, with what we're both kind of suggesting here. What you were saying a minute ago about trying to kind of be open and honest and engage in conversations, because if you do that in public, you run the risk of being misinterpreted. You run the risk of people kind of not taking you as a serious principled thinker. The example I'm thinking of was in a debate. a year or two ago, a pretty horrible debate, and I think anybody who's familiar with my channel to a higher extent will know which one I'm talking about when I say that. It was just an awful debate. One thing that happened was I got quoted in the debate, right? That my opponent looks at his notes and says, now Alex, at this video, at this minute, said that when the universe began to exist, it began to exist out of nothing. Now, you've got to justify that claim. And he railed on for about a minute about why I need to justify that claim.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. But I went and looked at the quote that he'd found. And what I'd done, I was talking about the Kalam cosmological argument. And I said, now I could say that the Kalam fails because the premise that the universe began to exist, we can't know that that's true. So I could just say that we don't know that, and therefore the argument fails. But look, I'm willing to just grant that premise just so that we can talk about the other premise, right? So I'll just grant that the universe did begin to exist. Then a bit later, I say, so when the universe began to exist, it began to exist out of nothing. That's what we're talking about. Right? And he took that quote and made it sound as though I was suggesting that the universe did begin to exist. Not that I just granted it for the sake of argument in earlier in the debate. Now, he was able to do that successfully.
Did you remember that? Did you remember that was the context, or you didn't remember until later?
Not at the time. That was the worst part about it, was that at the time I just kind of went like, well, I wonder why I said that. And it happened twice in the debate. I also got quoted on the phrase. Actually, this is what I was talking about with you, Cameron. When we had the contingency argument, I said in this debate that I think that there might be necessity in the universe. Necessity might exist, and my opponent says, but in your debate with Cameron Bertuzzi, you said that determinism follows from necessity or something like that. So like if I believe in determinism, then I must believe in necessity, because I said that determinism follows from necessity and I believe in determinism, therefore I must believe in necessity. Not realizing that what I meant by that phrase was that if you have necessity, then I think determinism follows, not if you have determinism, then it must come from necessity. In the same way that, my hair getting wet follows from me standing out in the rain, but I'm not saying that that's all it follows from, right? But again, I didn't remember the context of the quote in the heat of the moment. So I just have to kind of go, well, maybe I retract that. And then it's like, you're retracting that. You changed your mind then. And I was just kind of squirming in my chair thinking, what is going on here? And you compare something like that to a conversation that I had with Liz Jackson the last time I was on this show, which was which was open, it was honest, it was engaging. It's like, it's just worlds apart. And I'm trying to kind of work out what the difference is. Like, what determines whether one's going to be that kind of hostile debate environment or whether it's going to be a serious discussion? I just don't know.
Yeah, I've been pondering this too, because I've noticed that there are kind of like these different rules for the different games. So in the academic world, you kind of get points if you admit to being wrong about something, because it signals that you really want the truth and you're not just clinging to your original flag or whatever. But then like in a public debate context, it seems like you get points. I've noticed if you can show that there's social proof, like a whole bunch of smart people agree with you, and that your views today are consistent with all the views you've ever had in the past. So like you're just this machine-like mind that never gets anything wrong. And I think what's going on there is it's pointing to your credibility. Like if you're getting things right, then you're trustworthy. If you're getting things wrong, how can we trust you now, right? And it's interesting because, Alex, you gave examples where you actually meant something different. There was an explanation, so it wasn't even that you updated your thinking. But there are things where your thinking has updated. And so sometimes I'll get emails, people will ask me a question. It's like, well, how does this fit with something you published over here or said over here? It's like, okay, well, maybe it just doesn't fit. Like, actually, my view has kind of moved on since then. Like, now what? That's why it's like with these different rules, you can't win at two different games at the same time. So you almost have to pick one. So, if the goal is to kind of win in a contest of ideas, there's a kind of competition, there's a play, you want to display the strength of a position, then study for that game and play by its rules. And then if your goal is to get to truth, and you can maybe play both games at different times, right? But then you got to kind of pick up the other rules that help you to get to truth, which means kind of laying down your view, seeing it from another perspective, looking for synthesis. I mean, I imagine debates that I haven't been in, but like I imagine if I were, I would lose because I would think of the opponent's strongest position, and then I would think of my weakest position, and that would be the most interesting place for me to think about, because that's the place for the most discovery to come through for me. And then I would look for kind of a synthesis between us. And so I'd like come over and we'd be dwelling on my weakest position and on their strongest position. And that's probably not going to look good for me as far as like winning that debate at all. I would lose.
Yeah. It's one of my least favorite things. One of my least favorite things when people kind of will quote you from something you've said in the past and say, but you said this, so how do you square it? It's like, look, I'm here. I'm right here. Just ask me what I think now. It'd be like if I made some argument and somebody turned around and said, but that doesn't square with like it being morally permissible to eat meat or something like that. It's like, yeah, I changed my mind. Like again, like debate me, not my quote book. Who cares what I said in the past? You're
not a real human being. You're a cosmic skeptic. That's what you are. So if we can show inconsistency between your system, we can break the type.
But this is what people want, right? Because they want an ability to kind of put out an expose on a person rather than the person's ideas. It's kind of like an ad hominem in disguise. I think we'd save a lot of time in debate if people could recognize fallacious thinking, but not everybody kind of says this. Everybody says like people should be educated on logical fallacies, but it's not just people not realizing when they're being used, but people I find, at least online, in the modern age, if I can say such a stupid phrase, tend to be using them more than they should, not less than they should, but kind of recognizing them where they don't exist. I mean, I don't know how many times I hear someone say that's a straw man, or that's an ad hominem or something like that, when it just simply isn't. It's like it's the first thing you hear in any response video. It's kind of like a straw man. It's like, is it like it's everything this person is saying can't be a straw man, and I hear it all the time.
I wish I could.
We
like,
just need to recognize what they actually are.
To the internet,
it's honestly just the most overused thing in the world. I see it from absolutely everywhere. It's kind of like the thing to shut people down because someone says that's a straw man, and you're just kind of like, because obviously, if you think I've misrepresented your argument, because it's your argument, people are going to believe what you're saying there. But people also misunderstand the ad hominem. If I say that someone makes such a terrible argument that I cannot believe their stupidity, someone says it's an ad hominem. It's an ad hominem if I say you're stupid, therefore you're wrong. If I say you're wrong, therefore you're stupid, that's perfectly consistent.
Yeah, I think what happens there is there will be this rationality flag, and that if people feel like their rationality is called into question, I mean, I know for myself, it's like, I mean, this is something that I've had to kind of own that, I actually have insecurities, and that if somebody is saying that, I actually don't like truth, or I'm not rational, unless I can convince them that I'm right, I'm not rational. But then I start spinning my wheels, like trying to get, demonstrate that, actually, even if we disagree, like maybe I am rational. It's a complete distraction. Like it takes away from actually looking at, what's true. And I feel like I've had to almost like free myself from that distraction a little bit, and almost like not take things personally and just realize that, I probably am not rational. So now
Josh, there's in your work, I've read a lot of your stuff, but one thing that I've noticed that's really interesting and I think is important to highlight for at least a little bit is the fact that when you write an article, you'll be like, well, here's like a way that you could respond to this. And then you'll like leave it open. You won't necessarily like give a rebuttal to it. You'll just be like, look, here's an option for you to completely just avoid this line of argumentation. So what's like behind that? Why do you do that?
I want people to see things for themselves. So like, it isn't about me. Sometimes people ask me, well, what do I think about this? And again, even going back to this question of whether I'm being rational, it's like, well, I don't want to think about myself. Like really what I want to do is create some pathways that people can investigate for themselves and sort of own their own journey. And the reason why I want to do that is because I feel like if people can just see it for themselves, then that's going to be the most helpful to them. And so I'll create this way out. Part of it is, I want people to have the freedom. Like they don't have to be locked in. I'm not saying you're going to be irrational if you disagree with this. There was an article that I published in graduate school, and it was an argument for a necessary foundation of existence. And it was the first part in a two-part argument for theism. It was very interesting because there was a blog that I found where they were analyzing my article. And I was very curious, like what they were going to say, and I thought, their summary is like really good. So their critique is probably going to be helpful to me. And what they did instead was they added some stuff by Swinburne and some stuff drawing out the implications of a necessary foundation. And at the end of the article, they said that they hoped that their audience would understand why they've come to a newfound belief in God. They were actually persuaded by the article. This was really weird to me because in my actual article, I had a section called A Way Out. And I remember thinking like, well, why didn't they just take the way out? Because there was a way out. And ultimately, I mean, somebody could take that way out. And but it's going to depend on what they find reasonable from their own perspective. And the reason why I mention that is not to point to, oh, here's a particular argument for theism. It's to point to the value of like inviting each person to almost like see it for themselves. Because I feel like one of the things that gets in the way of truth is when you sort of are part of a camp or a group and other people are thinking for you. And then I actually wrote this down as like one of the strategies, which is to cross fences. So it's sort of like scary to go into new territory, especially if the people in a certain fence say that these people over in that fence are dangerous and you shouldn't go over there. But if you actually just like go over there and you cross that fence and then you see things from a new angle, a new perspective, then you safeguard yourself from just believing based on authority or based on what other people think. You actually increase your chances of seeing things for yourself. And that is, I mean, I get really passionate about this because this is a theme. I feel like people can get themselves liberated from false beliefs by just like checking if they see a headline, at least read the abstract of the peer-reviewed scientific article. At least do that. I mean, how many headlines actually contradict the data that's in the scientific article that's cited in that actual article? This happens all the time, but you'll never find that out if you don't actually check it for yourself. So I think that's one of my reasons why I want to have like ways out, or I kind of think in terms of pathways to explore, and kind of just like leave it to you to explore those pathways and see, okay, does this make sense to you? And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, don't worry about it. Like, some of
the language that you used in the past is like, this is a barrier for someone to come to a true belief. And I think to tie it back together with what we were talking about earlier about debates and how I think debates can sometimes be a barrier to truth because you just sort of entrench yourself in your own position, especially if you're like in the debate yourself. And we're saying all this, so like we're saying all this bad stuff about debating, and I'm like about to engage in one in like a week. But so I think that debates have their place, and Alex, you mentioned the same thing, and I think that we'll all probably agree on that debates have their place, but there are a lot of downsides to them, and they can be in some ways a barrier to truth.
For example, one of the ways that I feel like it's helpful to get more truth is just to turn the board position around. So say you're playing with the white pieces, it looks like you have a winning position. Sometimes it might help to just stand up and literally go to the other side and see it from the white perspective and kind of play with their pieces. Well, you don't have time to do that in a debate, right? Like you can't do that. Like debate's not a time for you to play out new moves, right? And so, debates have their place, but if you're trying to get a greater understanding of a board position, turn the board around, see if you can play black and win. If you can, I can tell you like that there was a conversation I was having in graduate school with philosopher Jeff Speaks on some technical question in the philosophy of language. And I must have been an annoying graduate school student because I kept responding to every email with like objections. And I kept wanting to like see how I could convince him that I was right. And I couldn't do it. And I had this moment where I just like felt like if I can't convince him, like something's wrong, like something's gone wrong here. And even my wife was thinking that Jeff Speaks was right on this particular topic. And I couldn't see it, but I was seeing my side. And eventually I just turned the board around, played with the other pieces, and I saw things I never saw before. And at this point, I think that he had the truth on that particular question. And I don't think I would have been able to see that without actually turning the board around. And so I think that's where people can get stuck because they don't actually turn the board around. They're just stuck playing one side. And it can be scary to turn the board around, You might discover you're losing. You might discover you're wrong. But there's also kind of a joy and a fun in discovering something new. So.
But I mean, also let's be clear that it's not just about trying to prove yourself wrong. It's also an opportunity to prove yourself right. Did I lose you there? I think the connection seems to be going funny.
Yeah, your connection kind of went in and out, but I think it's back now.
Okay. I think oftentimes these discussions are framed in terms of quite rightfully in terms of saying, I'm lost. I'm worried about my connection.
Yeah, I think it is your connection, unfortunately, because I'm still getting Josh coming through pretty clear.
Hopefully if I just give it a second, seems to be okay now. It's a bit up and down at the moment. I'm sure everyone else in the house is using the internet because nobody's doing anything else these days. I think these discussions are often framed, try lucky, quite rightfully so, in terms of, hey, make sure you're engaging in this stuff properly because you want to make sure that, you want to make sure that you're not holding false beliefs. You want to be able to prove yourself wrong, but you also want to be able to prove yourself right. I mean, I don't know, one of the first videos, it's kind of a hallmark of YouTube atheism is to make an argument, is to make a video about teleological arguments. It's to make a video about the design argument, right? You talk about William Paley, you talk about the watchmaker analogy, and I don't know how many times in a video or in a debate I'd spoken about Paley's view and the watchmaker analogy and why I think it's flawed. And it occurred to me that I'd never read Natural Theology. Right? I never actually read the book. I mean, I was pretty sure I knew what he said because I'd heard other people say it. But then I was like, well, who have I heard recounting Paley's argument? Like actually Paley's argument specifically? Well, it's only really been atheist debaters. That's the only place I've heard it from. And so I thought, man, I should actually read the book. So I was on an airplane once and I read Natural Theology, and lo and behold, I still thought it was pretty shoddy. Like I didn't think it was any good, but at least kind of I had the sigh of relief afterwards, thinking that now I don't have to kind of say through gritted teeth, yeah, Paley's argument, as far as I understand it, says that I can just say, no, look, I've read Natural Theology and I think it's wrong for this reason. But it was just like, why didn't I do that earlier? Reading it gave me more confidence and legitimacy in my own view. And had it not done that, had it had the opposite effect, then it would have been it would have served equal utility for me because I would have stopped referring to a belief that I wouldn't hold anymore, So whichever way it goes, it's going to be useful for you. But it's not just about trying to prove yourself wrong. I mean, we should give ourselves some credit here. We do get things right sometimes, and it's a good idea to try to justify your beliefs just as much as prove them wrong. But oftentimes by trying to prove them wrong, that's how you end up justifying them, if you know what I mean, because that's kind of the way to do it. That's what Mill says in On Liberty. It's kind of the one of the base principles. It's like, I don't trust your opinion unless you've subjected it to scrutiny, right? If you haven't done that, then I just don't care what you have to say.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, in mathematics, sometimes there'll be a conjecture. You think it's true, and you're looking for a way to really make it clear, really to prove it true. And the belief that it's true actually kind of concentrates your focus and organizes your research so you can find a path that gets you there. And then if you can't get a path that gets you there, then you might start re-questioning the belief. It's actually kind of curious, Alex, to ask you if you've had a conversation with somebody where you thought that it was true, some particular belief, and maybe you even did the research and it even increased your confidence that it was true, but you're in conversation with somebody and you couldn't get them to agree with you about that. How do you respond to that? I mean, what happens for you? I mean, do you start to feel well, maybe I shouldn't be so confident, or do you feel like maybe you could tell a story about why they aren't really understanding the argument, or does it depend on the case? Kind of curious just to hear more.
I do think it really does depend on the case. I mean, it happens all of the time with animal rights talk, right? But there is a difference between somebody just kind of not getting it, kind of you can just tell the argument isn't landing, in which case you just try a different approach. There are always multiple approaches to the same problem. It's like think of it as kind of like different methods of teaching. When you make a YouTube channel, you're essentially kind of assuming the same kind of techniques as a teacher. You have a class. It's like a 30-minute long presentation of an idea, trying to get everyone in the room to kind of be on the same page as you. It's a similar kind of thing to teaching. And so when you're having a discussion with someone, you're doing the same kind of thing. You're trying to break things down so that they're understandable and so that they're going to be receptive to the other person. Sometimes they're just not, right? The thing that I think is the most important thing to pay attention to is whether the reason it's not landing is because of you or because of them. Is it because you're not expressing yourself well, or is it because they've got this barrier up? And if they've got this barrier up, that's a harder thing to tackle, but we shouldn't just kind of give up on them, because people do change their minds on even kind of quite firm ideas, but how to do it, I think it's tricky. I think the most effective way in my experience is to take things that they already believe in and discuss them. It seems irrelevant for the beginning of the discussion, but you say, okay, let me just derail the conversation about animal rights. Let's talk about human rights or something like that. Let's talk about why you're not a racist, for example. And we kind of talk that out and we break it down to principles. So we kind of conclude and say, okay, so let me get this straight. You believe this principle, right, which we've extrapolated from this other belief. And now it's like, okay, well, now can you just demonstrate to me why you don't think this principle applies here? And all of a sudden, you've as you say, you've turned the chess table round on them, and now they're kind of doing the arguing for you. That's an effective way of doing it. And I have a lot more confidence than some people do in terms of people being able to change their opinion, mainly because of my own experience of myself, right? It's like there are people who, when you talk to them, you just think there's no way this is ever going to get through. But like, I did the same thing. I a few years ago, I was asked about like why I'm not a vegan or something like that on Twitter. What's the main reason that's stopping you from giving up animal products? And I just retweeted it and said meat or something like that. Like, haha, very funny, how genius. And I found it again like recently, and I went back and I thought, God, if only you knew what was going to become of you, right? And I went back and I actually apologized to the person that had tweeted me originally, basically saying like, I guess you were right. But like the fact that that's happened to me a few times in different areas. I mean, there are things that I've said in the past. This should be another step, is like always be listening to what you used to say and see if you have changed your mind without even realizing it. There are some things I've said in the past that are they verge on embarrassing when it comes to either the idea or the decorum. The fact that I've managed to kind of pull a total 180 on those kind of things implies that I think other people are capable of doing it too. But I don't know. I don't know what you think on this in terms of when the barrier does just go up and you are left in that situation of just thinking there's just no way I'm getting through to this person. Is that a good reason to think that maybe you've got something wrong?
Yeah, it does seem to depend on the person. I've noticed some people, they kind of care more about like where principles lead or where reason leads or where evidence leads. Some people are more kind of attracted to like a story or a narrative. And so if there's a convincing story that puts together a lot of data for them, that will have more of a grip on them than an argument. For me, the arguments have such a strong, like I'm a victim of possibly following a pathway of reason that leads me to think that there are no tables or chairs. I mean, like that's an open question for me, to be honest. My advisor was Peter Vandenwagen. He famously argues that, there aren't any tables or chairs. And his arguments are very convincing, so I'm moved by that. But if somebody else who's kind of more in a story frame and they tell a story of tables and chairs, people, and like how do they sit together for coffee if they're not sitting on anything, It's like, all right, well, I'll have that story. We might come into tension if I try to kind of turn the board around them and use their principles and show that it leads to a contradiction. I've had this experience where it's almost like it's not helpful to them. But I've also had the experience where it is helpful, where I just show how on their beliefs, some new belief follows that they didn't see before, and they really appreciate that. So it does seem like it depends on the person a lot. And also something else, as you were talking, I was considering that there's a difference between like influence, like techniques for influence. And I've been studying some of the sort of psychological principles. There's this book called Made to Stick. It's about like how ideas go viral. And he talks about how if you can make it concrete, if you have like a concrete image or picture, if you can make it simple, if you can put it into a story, it's more likely to like stick and to flow from mind to mind. That's like the psychology of persuasion versus I think like what we kind of care about is like, but what's true? Like, so I think the worry that I would have is if somebody gets very persuasive and very convincing, is it based on actual sight? Like, is that what it is? Or is it just like they're really good at persuading people? And so there's a way in which, I don't know, I mean, different people will have different beliefs. And sometimes it's like not my place maybe to kind of untangle all the psychological roots of their belief. But if I successfully did untangle that and even change their mind in some way, I'm not sure, like maybe I didn't even help them. I didn't even help them see what was true, So I guess that's kind of maybe my own personality. Like I would rather just kind of think about, okay, like where do the arguments lead? How do I actually get to truth? Like there's something just very fascinating about that for me. And sometimes the truth, like sometimes I will see something that I know people in the audience aren't necessarily going to find convincing, but then it's hard for me because I think, no, but that is true. I could give a lot of examples, but I won't right now. But this happens a lot. I like there's this tension between kind of how are you persuasive versus like how do you actually get to truth? And sometimes I think you have to kind of choose between them.
Do you
Not
think
to say
that
you can't bring them together, but go ahead.
Not to change the topic too much, but do you guys think that it's easier to see bias in other people than it is to like recognize the own bias in ourselves? I mean, like it happens to me a lot where I'm engaging someone and I'm like, the reason why they're not seeing this is because they're just biased in some way. And it's very rare that I'll put it back on myself and be like, well, you know, is it something that I'm not seeing? Is there some reason why I want to believe this or want to defend this view? I think that just happens a lot. It's not just atheists that do this. It's not just theists that do this. I think it's just sort of a natural human tendency is to like look for the bias in other people. And then also to be like, yeah, all of these people are biased, and then just completely forget that, oh, wait, I'm human too. I'm fully capable of bias myself. And so the reason why I kind of point this out is when people say that, oh, look, you're biased or this person's biased, or when even people say we're all biased, I just kind of think, I mean, yeah, that's true. We're biased. Everyone is biased in some way. But at the same time, like let's recognize that and then let's do what we can to like overcome it and just work together, move forward and go toward truth. So when people say like, when people point out bias, I'm just like, okay, yeah, we're biased, it's easier. But then let's progress. Let's have the conversation.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's easier to think you see bias in somebody else. And I think one thing that's made me doubt the reliability of seeing bias in other people, mind reading, is like how many times that somebody reads a motive that I definitely don't have that motive. Like I might have other vices, but it wasn't that one. Or I'll see somebody read a motive of somebody that I know very well, very personally. It's like, no, that's not what my wife was trying to do. And so I think we think that we see bias in other people. And maybe what happens is we spend more time trying to sort of scrutinize and tell a story of why the other person has gone wrong. And we don't spend as much time. I think this is kind of your point, Cameron. This is a very practical application point, which is just like to actually take some time and do some introspection or even just invite somebody else to say, hey, what do you see? Like somebody who knows you. And I have read in the literature on psychology that if you take somebody else's perspective, if you actually just take the time to turn the table and move into their position, it does actually make a difference. It does help to depolarize that and to be more accurate in your perception.
Yeah, I think it's not worth trying to overcome bias. It's worth just trying to recognize it, right? I mean, like, as you say, Cameron, bias is built into the human condition. It's something that's always going to be there. This is one of the reasons why I like rationalistic approaches. And as you say, they're kind of a storytelling approach, but also the rationalistic approach. I've come across this idea as well. I think it's an interesting one. The reason that I come down on rationalistic approaches in terms of what convinces me of things is because it tends to kind of remove the importance of bias, right? If somebody makes an argument, I can recognize that their motivation for presenting the argument could be rooted in utter bias, but that wouldn't affect how strong the argument is when it's laid out as a syllogism, right? Whereas if somebody has a motivation for presenting a story, then actually the way that you tell the story can actually have an effect on how convincing it is. So I think there's an asymmetry there. But like, it is worth trying to recognize your biases, but start with the most obvious. Like it just sit and kind of just think about what is motivating you to do what you have to do, for example. Like, I mean, I surely have a bias towards wanting kind of arguments for religion to be flawed, because if they are, then I can make a video that I know my audience will like. It might get a lot of views, and maybe I'll make some money or something like that, right? Like that's a bias I have, like undeniably. And it's like I can try and kind of say I'm gonna rid that bias from myself, but it's just not something that can be done. It's like, yeah, I want to make videos, I want to get a lot of views, like I want to get subscribers, like that's the whole reason you do this kind of thing, right? So like that bias, so to speak, is never going away, and you should never trust anybody who says that they have gotten rid of their bias. Instead, I just say, listen, like, obviously, like, I'm in a camp here, but this is what I think. Bear that in mind. It's interesting because the only kind of counterexample I can think to this in my own situation is with veganism, because I have the opposite bias. I really don't want it to be true. I really want to be wrong about this one. It's a really unique case for me, because it's one of those times where my bias is in the opposite direction. That's one of the reasons why, in fact, I'm so convinced by it and so assured of myself in this position, is because of the fact that my bias runs exactly against it. So that's those are probably the arguments you should most trust. Those are the arguments that really have convinced you and that you really do think are sound, are the ones that have run against your bias. But don't try and get rid of the bias. It's not going anywhere.
Before we get to questions, I want to do one more thing, talk about one more subject, which is rhetoric, and how we can sort of overcome or not let rhetoric affect our thinking. Because you sort of mentioned this earlier, Alex, like listening to Christopher Hitchins talk about the Iraq War and his views on it. You can listen to someone, doesn't have to be Hitchins, can be anybody. If they're, persuasive, if they have good rhetorical skills, they can make something seem a whole lot more persuasive, a whole lot more rational than it actually is. And so what sort of practical things do you guys do in order to overcome that, not be swayed by rhetoric? One thing that I do, and by the way, I just did the thing where I tagged on the second sentence to the end of the last word so that I could keep talking. So one of the things that I do is I read transcripts. So like the debate between William Lane Craig and Sean Carroll. So I think that, well, everyone knows that William Lane Craig is super, super good on rhetoric. And I thought in that debate, Sean Carroll actually sort of outgunned Craig in the rhetoric department. But anyways, to overcome the rhetorical side of that debate, which was super strong, I just read through the transcripts. And so that's one of the things that I do in order to not be swayed by the rhetoric, not be swayed by tone and inflection, the way people are talking, is to just read the actual words. And instead of, just reading transcripts. So what type of things do you guys do?
For me, one thing would be to see if I can actually take their argument and fill in all the premises, because a lot of arguments are kind of like one premise arguments, especially like on the radio. You hear this, like on the news, popular presentations, and they focus your mind on a true premise. But then the conclusion doesn't follow from that premise. And so there are these hidden premises. And what's hard there is that you don't see what you don't see. So you don't see the premises that aren't stated. So one thing that I'll try to do is see, okay, can I actually reconstruct the argument? And then usually I'll discover all sorts of additional complexities that were hidden. So that would be one thing.
I couldn't agree more. One kind of effective method here is not just kind of filling in the gaps, but just restating what's been said. I mean, whenever you hear an argument, it's more effective to other people because you kind of remember to do it, but do it to yourself as well. Just say, look, just repeat the sentence that you just applauded, Mr. Audience Member. Like, what did he actually say? Because they're not going to be able to say it in the same way that he did, right? So like, you take Hitchins' bit on the celestial North Korea, and everyone goes, that's brilliant. You say, okay, what did he actually just say? It's like, well, God is like a dictator because he is all powerful, because you can't question his authority. So it's like all of a sudden it doesn't. I mean, it might still be a good argument. It might still be worth considering, but all of a sudden it doesn't sound so compelling. It also sucks the humor out of a debate, right? Because humor is one of the most important tools here. Now, I love the use of humor in debates. I think it's funny. I think comedy is one of the best ways to argue a point in many ways, because laughter is because it's involuntary, right? Isn't this something Freud said about how it's a window into the soul or something? Because it's like you don't get to choose when you laugh. So like if you get someone to laugh about a point that ridicules their position, it's like it's kind of a subconscious, lying on the back with the paws up kind of thing. But it is worth. I'm not saying that we should always take that out, because it's I'm not a dry human being. I enjoy it. But if you're really interested in the argument, take it out. I mean, take those classic hitch slap moments. When Frank Turek says, "Okay, let's call it evil. Where does evil come from?" And Hitchins goes, "Religion," and the whole audience erupts in laughter. Very funny. Okay, now as you say, Cameron, read the transcript. Like imagine it going down the same words but with a different kind of style of talk. Frank Turek goes, okay, well, let's call it evil, Christopher. Where do you think evil comes from? And he goes, religion, I think. You'd just be like, what? You'd be like, oh, well, you want to justify that, you know? It just completely takes out the power of the rhetoric. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy jokes and debates. It just, because now, like, kind of when I watched that, I don't really laugh anymore. I kind of cringe a little bit, you know? So, like, I don't know. There can still be things that are funny, but the reason things are funny is because they contain an element of truth. And so if you find yourself laughing, you've probably actually been subconsciously convinced of something in there, and you should probably work out what that is. And you'll find that once you realize that that you don't agree with it anymore, you just don't find it that funny anymore. I think that paying attention to when you laugh and just repeating the actual point on offer there is an important way to overcome it.
Is there anything else that you guys would like to talk about before we move to Q&A?
I'm ready.
I'm happy to take questions.
Cool. All right, let me switch my scene here. And so we did have one super chat. It's worth talking about this for a second. Tanner Terry says all three of these channels should have Jay Dyer on. So if you don't know who Jay Dyer is, he's a YouTuber, Christian Orthodox, and I was actually planning on having him come on my channel to have a debate with Inspiring Philosophy, and in a private message which got posted on Inspiring Philosophy's Facebook page, I basically told him, hey, look, I watched one of your previous debates and with Matt Dillahunty, and I actually thought that Matt Dillahunty won that debate against you. And after I said that, in the private message that we had, he started to throw out a lot of insults, and it was just a really weird situation. So, and if you want to read it, if you want to see what actually happened, you can go to Inspiring Philosophy's Facebook page and just scroll through, and you can actually see that conversation. But it was a really weird situation, and so I decided I'm not going to have him on. I try to just keep really professional people on my channel, people who I take seriously and that you should take seriously. And so those are the people that I try to limit my audience to. But if you guys have any thoughts on Jay Dyer or having him on, feel free to share. But I don't know have you ever heard of him?
I don't think so.
Alex? Okay. All right, let's get to the next question. From Meow Meow Meow, he says, or he or she says, have you read Jay Fodor's book, Unreasonable Faith, How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case? Fodor interacts with basically all of Craig's heavy academic work. For example, Craig's academic books on time and the resurrection. So yes, I have that book. I have it on Kindle, and I've read parts of it. And I think that he does a very, very good job of interacting with Craig's work on like the deepest level possible. So he'll take a dialectic of A theory or B theory as it relates to like the Kalam cosmological argument, and he'll like follow every single thread that Craig has ever said anywhere, and he'll like follow it to the end and then give a rebuttal to it. So obviously that's not to say that he's right in every case, but I think that he needs to be applauded in his rigor. It's just like, it's very, very good. And I think Graham Oppie even, I don't know if he, I think he endorsed the book. So I do have it. I haven't read the whole thing, but I think that it's a good contribution.
Yeah, I've seen some of Fodor's stuff on the philosophy of time, and he does go deep. I haven't read that particular book, but I would say, I would anticipate it probably advances the dialectic, and which is always helpful. But I can't speak to that particular book.
Have you heard of that one, Alex?
No, it's not something I've read. I'd be lucky to read anything at the moment that isn't related to my degree, because I'm just kind of like up to the ears in papers that I'm supposed to read. So I don't know if I actually will either get around to doing it, at least for the next 8 weeks. But it's not something I've read.
All right, we have another super chat from Meow. He says, Josh or Cam, please review Tom Talbot's Inescapable Love of God and Robin Perry Gregory McDonald's 2008 Evangelical Universalist, and also rematch Oppie versus Phaser on existential inertia. So I haven't read either of those books. I don't know that I plan on reading them. And Oppie and Phaser have been on my show twice in conversation. I don't know that I'll invite them back on for the same topic. They've discussed that, and so I'm open to having them back on. I don't know that they'll agree, but both of those conversations were a lot of fun. So, I mean, I am having Graham Oppie on with William Lane Craig in just a couple weeks, talking about the argument from math for theism, whether or not the applicability of math to the universe is any sort of evidence for God's existence. So that'll be interesting if you're interested in a discussion like that. Check out the if you go to my homepage on my YouTube channel, you can actually see the upcoming live stream. So that's one of them. Any thoughts, Josh?
Yeah. So I mean, I think a question behind this question is about maybe sort of removing unnecessary barriers to a version of Christianity. And another thing to add to that list would be this Yale Christian philosopher, Keith DeRose. He's got an article called Universalism and the Bible. And, speaking of sort of changing your mind, when I read that article, that was the first time that I ever thought that it was possible for somebody to actually believe that the biblical data supports a view on which people are ultimately rescued out of hell in the long term from the Bible. So now I wasn't convinced at that time by that one article, but it did set me on a journey. In fact, my wife and I actually have a book coming out, When Heaven Invades Hell, which is a dialogue in heaven, and it talks about all the sort of theological and biblical data that's relevant to this question about eschatology and kind of how you demarcate the lines of salvation. And Alex, I actually think that you would be very interested in some of these things because I think it could possibly open up a door to a version of a theory of God's role in the world that maybe you wouldn't find as objectionable as some of the particular versions of Christianity that you've interacted with publicly.
Yeah, that'd be great. Always looking for new ideas.
I mean, I think you'd be very interested in it. I'll send you something because I don't know. I was actually thinking of you in particular with respect to this topic because I've seen some of your videos that show some certain problems that you have with certain characterizations of Christianity, and I think that some of these articles could open another door for you, possibly.
Yeah, that would be really good. I was going to ask you to send it to me actually because one of the things that you come across a lot is people saying, you're painting all these people with a broad brush kind of thing. Like when you criticize Islam and someone says, but not all Muslims believe this. It's like, that's not the point. But sometimes that is actually true. That's why these days I try to be careful to say that when I'm criticizing a view, this is this person's view. This isn't the view of Christianity, for instance. So it's always useful to be able to have different kinds of Christianity to put up an attack for views.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we have.
I'll give you another kind that you could put up an attack and knock down.
That'd be great.
All right, so this question is from Tanner, and this has to do with epistemology. He says, if we are inquiring into whether our faculties are such as to provide the possibility of knowledge, you cannot use those same faculties to prove the validity of those faculties. Doesn't this destroy foundationalism?
No. So, this is a great question because it's about the circularity problem of how you can start having knowledge. So, I mean, the basic worry would be like, in order for me to have the knowledge of something, let's say the knowledge that I'm able to have thoughts, okay, that knowledge has to be based on something. Otherwise, it's baseless. And if it's baseless, how could it be knowledge? But if it's based on something, what is it going to be based on? Is it going to be based on your faculties? Well, if you have to believe that your faculties are reliable first, in order for your belief that you're having thoughts or could have thoughts, I'm just using that as an example, or you have hands, or take any example of something you think you know, then you run into this kind of circularity problem because, as they say, you have to somehow already know that your beliefs are based on a reliable process. I think that if this is a good example where it helps to just spell out the argument, because when you spell out the argument, you'll see there's actually a distinction between believing that your faculties are reliable and then that belief being a source of a belief formed by your faculty versus, okay, see, this is why it would be helpful to have this worked out in detail, because I have this picture in my mind. It's hard for me to know how to communicate this efficiently, and I'm doing a terrible job. But the idea here is that you don't have to believe that your faculties are reliable for your belief to reliably come from your faculties. For example, okay, I'm going to focus on a thought. Okay,
I think it'd be helpful to just define reliability, because reliability is something that people use a lot of times, but in epistemology it has a very specific usage.
Yeah.
It just means, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I've read enough of the epistemology literature that I have a pretty solid understanding of how it's typically used, which is basically just that your belief or your brain, so to speak, is reliable if it produces mostly true beliefs. So on the order of magnitude of maybe 2/3 to 3/4 percentage of true beliefs. If most of your beliefs are true, then the belief forming mechanism, whatever that is, your cognitive faculties are therefore reliable. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we're answering a question about reliability.
Foundationalism, yeah, and because you don't have to believe that reliabilism is true in order for your beliefs to be formed in a reliable way.
Right.
You don't have to have that belief. So that's the tricky thing. So I was going to use the example of, I just had a thought about spiders. I believe that I just had a thought about spiders. That belief comes from a memory. At the time, I think it came from direct awareness of my thought. I think I just had this inner light of awareness that justified that belief, grounded that belief. But I don't have to believe that my belief was formed in the way that I just described in order for it to have been formed in that particular way. Now, you could still ask me, well, why do you believe it was formed in that way? And that's where you use the particularist methodology, where you come up with examples of particular things that you know, and then you come up with a theory, like a scientist would, that best explains the observations of what you know. And then that can justify your belief that your faculties are reliable. So none of that shows that foundationalism is not true. In fact, I think the best argument for foundationalism is just to think of the alternatives. I mean, if foundationalism isn't true, then either you have an infinite set of beliefs that are required to justify any belief, or it's just flatly circular. But how can you justify something in a circle? And so, I mean, people could respond, well, maybe that's the only way. Well, then we have to see the argument for that. Why think, that's the only way? And I haven't seen any convincing arguments once they're laid out in their premise format.
Alex, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I actually don't really have anything to add here. It's something that I don't have a strong view on, or at least if I do, not one that I could justify very well. It's one of those areas like a belief in induction or something that I just kind of wouldn't make a case for because I just don't really know how I'm doing it yet,
All right, so here's a super chat, and this one isn't necessarily a question for either guest. It's actually a question for me. Justin's asking, hey Cameron, love your videos. I watched Inspiring Philosophy's video on the biblical flood. He seemed to read his conclusions into the text. Would you have a global versus local advocate on to discuss? Yeah, I'm open to that. I'm open to having some scholars on. That's what I try to do, is have people who are sort of at the top of their field in their respective area to come on and talk about whatever it is that they're an expert in. So I would love to have a discussion like that. I'm definitely open to it. I don't have anyone like off the top of my head who would be good advocates on either side. So that's really the only thing that would hold me back in the meantime. Plus, I'm sort of busy. I have a pretty full schedule here coming up in May. I have a lot of different things that are coming down the pipeline. So here's the next question from Indirish. He says, Dr. Rasmussen, are you working on deriving the consequences of an ontological argument starting from the premise it's possible perfection exists? I'm thinking they mean perfection. It seems like there are some amazing deductions that can be made from this premise.
Yeah, I have been thinking a lot about that lately. The only thing I would add is that I'm not starting with that premise. Alex mentioned the sort of reverse premise, possibly perfect thing does not exist, or possibly there is no God. And I think that reverse premise, it sort of cancels the epistemic force of an argument that starts with this possibility claim, unless you have some way to break the symmetry. I have been thinking recently, like every day when I take my baby for a walk, I'll be thinking about certain Gödel ontological arguments that start with more modest premises, like no positive property entails a negative property. And
wait, you have you're doing this while you're walking your, like, in a stroller with your baby?
Well, yeah,
outside?
Because there's nothing else occupying my mind, right? So there's the sky and the stars, and I'm trying to get my baby to sleep. What else am I going to do, right?
We should probably keep at least one eye on the baby, I think.
Baby's in my arms, but But yeah, so you can actually deduce the possibility of a perfect being from this no entailment premise, that positive properties don't entail negative ones, together with the premise that perfection is positive. But that's not enough for me, because I've been thinking actually about ways of articulating a support for the premise, the no entailment premise, and that's kind of been on the edge of my thinking lately. I don't have definitive results, but it does seem like there are some promising lines to explore there, and there are certain very specific lines that I've been thinking about recently that might actually work.
I mean, we can take a minute and discuss the ontological argument in a little bit more depth if you guys want. We have a bunch more questions that are still coming in, so we can't spend a whole lot of time. But Alex, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about when it comes to ontological arguments?
I mean, I would be interested in hearing what it is that you're working on there, Josh, because with at least with the modal version that we referenced earlier of the ontological argument, I kind of come to a sticking point at you're kind of left where you started. You're kind of, at least now you're in the position where you know that you're in no better of a position to know whether or not God exists, because you don't know whether it's either possible or it's not possible. But you do kind of get left at the point where you recognize that only one can be the case, and that if you decide that one is the case, that it becomes necessarily the case. So you're no better off than when you started in terms of your conclusion, but you at least now know that you can't think that both are possible, and that if you do decide that one is possible, that will lead you to necessity. But breaking that symmetry is the thing that I've been really interested in. So it's great to hear you kind of mention it there. Obviously, my bias, as it were, is to try and find a way to show that it's possible that God does not exist, rather than the alternative. But I'm trying to kind of engage this as honestly as possible, and I don't really see I haven't come across a good way. Not that I've thought about it too much. I haven't really come across a way to break it. So if you have a suggestion, I'm all ears.
Yeah, and I actually want to just affirm that not only am I very sympathetic with this problem of the symmetry, but I think even Alvin Plantinga is sympathetic with it, and perhaps more so than people might realize. He being the sort of author.
You mean currently, right?
Yeah.
Because in the past he thought it was like a sort of knockdown argument.
Well, I don't think he ever thought it was knocked down. So in his first articulation of it, he said he thought it could be a reasonable basis of belief. Interestingly, even William Rowe, in his book on the cosmological argument, as a non-theist, thought the cosmological argument could be a reasonable path to belief. So to say that something is reasonable isn't thereby to say that it's knocked down. Philosophers make all these distinctions. And so it's not like in the contest of ideas where it's like, oh, I won, my argument works for everybody. It was just like, he was just reflecting, and he said, oh, this seems like it's a reasonable path, because you could just consider the possibility of God's existence, and that might just seem plausible. But I remember in a class with him, this was in graduate school, and he told me that in his younger days, he hadn't really teased out this distinction between seeing that something's possible and failing to see that it's impossible. I remember he would say this a few times in different contexts, and he would almost be trying to warn us, like, be careful, like, just because you can't see that something's impossible doesn't follow that you're actually seeing that it is possible. This comes up also in the problem of evil literature. It's like you can't see how there could be a good reason for that evil. Therefore, you're seeing that there probably isn't one, or there isn't one, or there possibly isn't one. And that, that just doesn't follow. And so it seems like in his most recent thinking about it that I've seen, he would kind of think of it as an interesting sort of pathway, but not one that is, I don't want to say decisive. I'm not in his head, so I can't say for sure, but I think he is sympathetic with the need to try to show that the possibility of God is somehow more plausible than the possibility of an empty world. I mean, Richard Swinburne, Christian philosopher, would disagree with Plantinga on this. I mean, he argues for the possibility of an empty world. In fact, Richard and I, we were at a conference together where we were debating this. This was our task, was to debate whether that was possible. And so I think that one does have to do more to break that symmetry. But then there are these interesting lines, these attempts at doing that. And so I think there can be more progress there. I mean, and this shows, again, just to highlight how you can make progress by slowing down the conversation, because in a debate you can't do that. Like you can't slow it down enough to get all these different nuances on the table.
So what are you currently working on? I think that was part of Alex's question. Is there anything that you're currently working on that might be of interest to him to check out?
So
on the symmetry problem? Yeah.
Okay. So Cesar Bernstein has an article, and I can send this to you so you can have it in the links or whatever. I can send this to you as well, Alex, that I've been thinking about. It's called Giving the Ontological Argument Its Due. And it develops one of these Gödelian lines from entailment. And it's certainly worth thinking about. I've been thinking about how to add supports to it. And my latest thinking on it is that I'm being sort of cautious because I'm still processing it. So I haven't come to any settled conclusions about it, but it seems like it's a promising path so far. And if I could just add one more thing about this, because I think that there is sort of this thought about ontological arguments in general, that basically they're kind of a trick. Like you're trying to sort of start with the concept of God, and like surely you can't show that something actually exists just from your a priori reflection. But then things start getting complex because there are all these arguments for Platonism from a priori reflection on the nature of abstracta and logic itself. I mean, there's these axioms of logic that entail that the axioms of logic are themselves necessary. And that if necessity implies truth and if truth implies existence, it follows that there's a necessarily existing logical landscape. And now there are details in that argument right there, but it's all a priori, and it convinces a lot of philosophers. And so now it's like, okay, well, in principle, you could argue that there's something actually real, external to your own head, just using a priori reasoning. And so then can we really see the limits of that? You know, it's sort of like I have this metaphor of when the internet first came out and we associate it with like Gmail and search, and we didn't have in mind all the possible applications for the internet, you know, with like car sharing and crowdfunding and all these different things. I think it's the same thing with reason, the light of reason. It's one thing to not see where reason can lead. It's another thing to see that reason can't lead to something. And so, I mean, if one thing is clear to me, it's that I do not see that reason cannot, by its own light, reveal that there's a perfect foundation. And in fact, it does seem to, for me at least, give me some plausible steps towards that. And this is a purely a priori argument. I mean, this is not my favorite argument. My favorite arguments are more empirically based, or based on causation and looking at the science of the origin of the universe. But just I can't rule out the purely a priori argument, and it actually seems like it might be plausible.
All right, so I have a question from Peter Kruger, who's he sent in a super chat. But the reason why I wanted to get to this is because it's on topic. So this was not a video on the ontological argument. We were supposed to be talking about bias and how to avoid bias. So this is a great question on that topic. He says, to what extent would defending the coherence of your worldview contribute to bias? You may see a weakness in your own argument, but dismiss it because your whole worldview would otherwise crumble.
I have some thoughts, but I've been talking a lot. Alex, do you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's get Alex in.
Sure. Let me just read this. To what extent would defending the coherence of your worldview contribute to bias? I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. How are you interpreting this question? Because you say you've got some things to say on it.
Well, the first thought that I was having, well, I'm sort of thinking of it as like there's sort of this risk, and maybe one category of people would be maybe like apologists who have a view that they're defending, whether it's veganism or the existence of God, you know, whatever it is that you're defending, that the very process of defending that kind of exacerbates the problem of bias. And so that's how I'm thinking of it.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think. It's not something I've really thought about before. I guess it would. I suppose it depends on the motivation. Like, why is it that you're defending the coherence of your worldview? If you're doing it just as a pure exercise in thinking, then I guess technically you're not really trying to defend the coherence of your worldview. You're just trying to see if it is coherent. You're not kind of trying to defend it. In other words, like defense would be the wrong word there. The word defense implies that it's something that you kind of care about keeping and you want to keep. And then it sounds like the motivation, that the bias might be in the motivation. And so the problem kind of already pre-exists. I don't think it's it's certainly not created by trying to defend the view, but then is it reinforced by trying to defend the view? I think if you're in the right mindset, it doesn't have to. I think that as long as you're actually paying attention to bias specifically, you can kind of escape it. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to syllogize everything and to make it such that you are working in purely rational terms or logical terms or something like that, and seeing if it works. So in other words, not trying to reconvince yourself, not trying to defend your view, so to speak, but trying to make sure it works. Like troubleshooting, just prodding all the parts and making sure all the buttons work correctly, rather than kind of saying, I want this to work, so now let me kind of try and keep showing why it works. Let me show why my computer is functioning properly, rather than just kind of actually running some malware and seeing if there are any faults. Like if you're trying to defend it, then maybe there's a problem in the motivation there. I don't know.
I just wanted to add that I think, Alex, what you said earlier about kind of owning your own biases, not just like pretending, oh, I don't have them, but like being aware of them actually can help a lot. And I was just thinking of an example where I was in a conversation with somebody and they were suggesting that the reason that I believed such and such was because I wanted to. And, like that bothered me. It's like, no, it's not because I want to, it's because of my arguments, And so I went back to the arguments. I was like trying to convince them it's not based on my desire. And it's almost like I would actually want to not want it, because then I can eliminate that bias. But like at the end, I was like, you know what? Actually, I do want this to be true.
Yeah.
And so instead of just pretending that I don't, like, I'm going to just own that. Like, I think it would be really great if reality were ultimately at its fundamental level loving and meaningful in the sense of robust, ontological, objective meaning and mind. It's like, and that everything works for good. Like there's a reason, like, yeah, like I do want that to be true, so what can I do about that? Maybe just follow your advice, Alex, and just like be aware of that bias and then kind of work hard on troubleshooting. And this was the other thought that I had, was to also even just kind of check your motivations. So it's one thing to have a desire, and then it's another thing to be motivated by that desire. And of course, this is difficult. It's hard to even check your own motivations. But this was the first thing that I put on my list of strategies. No, it was the second thing, which is to pay attention to what you're aiming for. And I know for myself, it's like sometimes I'm aiming to maybe protect an argument or protect a system. And that feels different internally than aiming to discover, like, is it really true? And like you have to, each person has to really pay attention to themselves. Like nobody else can do that for you. And, you can say that you're doing one thing or another, but like ultimately only you are responsible to do that. And only I'm responsible to do that for myself. And I think that can help if you just pay attention. Like, why do I keep coming back to this conversation like a moth to a flame? Is it because I'm trying to get more truth, or is it because I'm trying to vindicate myself? Like what's going on here? What's my motivation? And I think for me, motivations can vary, but if I pay attention, that can help me to be more aware.
So I have another question, and this one is along the same lines. So Alex, you can even continue your thought here if you'd like. For Maverick Christian, he says, for both, what is your best advice for overcoming your own biases?
It's tricky because kind of I've already kind of said that you can't exactly overcome certain biases. I think the thing to know would be to pedal off what Josh just said, and say that it's not mutually exclusive to want something to be true, but also want to have a serious and honest conversation about it. Like overcoming your bias, part of that is kind of accepting that, I do want this to be true, but recognizing that that's not the same as wishful thinking. But the problem is, right, if you're going to allow yourself to encompass bias in that same respect, you have to allow it for other people as well. So a corollary of this is that when you're debating with somebody, if they want it to be true, if Josh and I were debating something and Josh was like, yeah, no, I do want this belief to be true, I shouldn't be sitting here going, look, you believe this because you want it to be true. If I had reason to think that, then maybe I could suggest it. But just the fact that you want it to be true shouldn't be enough of a justification for me to think that that's actually motivating your reasoning. So allow yourself the same sensibility. Like you have to kind of pay the cost of not being able to make that easy criticism of other people. But it makes it easier for you because that bias that you have, I think, have I frozen again? Oh,
No,
okay.
you're here
I
for
couldn't.
me. Yeah.
I,
Yeah,
I
you're
couldn't
good.
tell because my screen just froze, and this is the thing. Like the past few times it's happened, when I freeze, I just kind of stop and wait. But then I have this fear that I haven't actually frozen, and I just stop talking with no explanation and just kind of stare at the screen for a minute. But yeah, I think I was roughly finished with what I was saying anyway.
Yeah, no,
Josh.
it's a
Yeah.
great question. I feel like one of the things I wrote down was to go into other fences. Sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't go over there. Like, that's dangerous. It's like danger. You might fall, be led astray or whatever, whatever the fences are. And everybody, there's thousands of fences, right? There's thousands of ways of demarcating the debates. The idea of drama and the idea of conflict. But I feel like it does help to, and I like what Alex said, is like, you have biases. So you just have to recognize that. But I think it does make a difference to spend some time with other people on other sides of a fence. I don't mean like talking across a fence. I mean, actually like opening up the gate, like going into the other fence and like just sitting with them and like listening and asking questions. It's not that you don't object or don't disagree, but you take some time to see if you can even fill it out. Like before you raise those objections, like maybe you can even articulate their viewpoint better than they do, and I think that does help. Like, when I really think about, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to sort of emphasize what you were saying. I was in a conversation. I think this was a personal conversation that I was having with Trent Doherty. I can't remember when it was, but he was telling me I actually can't remember now if it was a private conversation that we were having or whether or not I saw this in a video that he did. But he was talking about his work on the problem of evil. And if you don't know who he is, Trent Doherty has some really amazing work on the problem of evil. He has a really great book on it. It's on my bookshelf back here. It's on the problem of animal pain, which I think is it is the most difficult problem to overcome, the problem of evil. Anyways, he was talking about the fact that when he was doing all of his work and he was researching like what are the actual atheist philosophers saying about the problem of evil, like what are the best arguments, and he was saying that there were times when he was in his research that he was like it would really get to him because of like how seriously he was taking the problem and how it was like he just had like some bad days, bad nights, like sleepless nights because of how seriously he was taking this problem and seriously looking into the arguments. When I heard that for the first time, I was thinking, have I ever been in a situation like that where like I took an argument so seriously that it was giving me problems, like sleeping problems? And I can't say that I have. Like I can't say that I've looked at something, I've tried to put myself in another person's shoes to the extent where it had like a personal effect on me to that degree. So I don't know, just to emphasize your point, I think that, and I've noticed in my own life, to just speak more about some bias, my own personal bias, is that I don't think that I've done that to the extent that I've seen, philosophers do this. So I think that it's difficult to do. We don't normally do it, but I think that it's good to do that, especially if you're, in this process of trying to overcome bias.
Yeah, make friends with people, like go to the pub, have a discussion. Like this is where this stuff gets born. This is where I've had some of the best discussions in my life. You have a bit of social lubricant. You just kind of let your ideas free flow. You let them kind of mingle in the air. It almost feels as though if you're just at the pub having a drink with somebody and you're discussing some ideas, that the ideas just kind of escape you and the other person. They just kind of float around in the air and intermingle with each other, and you just kind of see the picture that results. It's a wonderful way of having discussion versus kind of having a motive. Even like a motive like we have today, which is to discuss a specific topic and bring our certain points to it. There's something different about just kind of getting to know somebody and just talking to them on a general basis, having a laugh with them, telling jokes, and sometimes slipping in a serious conversation. But it's a good way to tell if you are really, if you really have stepped over the fence, is to see if you can actually empathize with them. That's why people can get walked up, because they're actually empathizing with the thing that they're considering. For somebody who wants to explain why animal suffering is justified, right? For them to get worked up about animal suffering means that they really actually have considered how bad it is, right? They're not just the kind of person who's gone, there's some explanation for it. Like, here's a clever argument to show, because the people who are putting forward the argument want to say, no, just stop and really think about the suffering that's going on. I mean, just really think about it. And if somebody's actually getting upset about it, or somebody makes an argument and they get emotional, or they're losing sleep thinking about the suffering of animals, and they're actually taking it seriously. And you should see if that kind of thing is happening to you. If you're somebody who argues about the problem of evil a lot, and someone says, why would God allow kids to get cancer, and you go, because of this, and you reel off the reasons. It's like, how can you think about a kid with cancer and not have a reaction to that? Does that imply that maybe you're not really thinking about it in the same way that the other person is? And maybe we shouldn't think about it emotionally, but you should at least try to understand why somebody else would think about it emotionally, if then just so that you can say, listen, I genuinely understand the emotional objection to this, but I think that rationality prevails, for instance. But you have to actually be in that position to be able to make that judgment. You can't just say, well, I'm sure it prevails even though I haven't been in that position. You have to be in both, I think.
I really want to just add to your point, Alex, about the friendship, the value of the friendship. And this is one of the reasons, people who know me, they know that I talk a lot about the value of coming into rapport with your interlocutor. And one of the reasons for that is because I've seen that ideas flow, insights flow back and forth so much more when there's a kind of psychological rapport. And this isn't a kind of psychological manipulation game. It's like, let's be friends. Then maybe instead of speaking each other across the fence, we can kind of sit together at a table and we can build something new. Like maybe I have some pieces, you have some pieces. Maybe the nature of reality actually includes some of my pieces and some of yours. Maybe there's a synthesis. And I will tell you from many conversations with philosophers and non-philosophers that it seems like that tends to be the trajectory of a productive conversation. It's not that, we found out that, one of us was wrong. It was like, actually, there was just more complexity. And neither of us could really see it all on our own, which is why like those connections, those relationships really, I think, are essential to seeing more truth. Like we do, it almost sounds cheesy, but like we actually need each other to see more truth than we can see on our own.
Yeah, well,
and that will never happen if we always see each other as enemies. So.
Consider, for example, in our conversation today, this is the first time we've properly met, Josh, and we say something like, we make a point and we say, it's like what we were saying about the ontological argument earlier, right? And we use that as an example. How much time do we save by just saying, it's kind of like this thing we talked about before. Like, I know we're both on the same page about this, and then you just use that as a springboard. If you're friends with somebody, exponentially growing are the opportunities for you to kind of start a conversation, not having to waste time getting to the kind of ground level and working out each other's epistemology. You already know what the other person thinks. You spent so much time with them that you can just kind of say, I've got one for you, like if you're arguing with someone about free will and they say, is everything, I've got one for you, like, are there some objects that don't admit of determination, right? And like immediately I know why that's an objection to my position, and I know like the kind of conversation that person's trying to have. We don't have to run through the premises for the free will argument before having that conversation. If you're friends with somebody, like, and you've had a lot of conversations with them, you save so much time when you want to have a new conversation, because you can just use all kind of other areas to springboard off of. And that is just simply something that can only come about if you've kind of spent a lot of time with them. That's the only way you can bring about that kind of relationship. So make friends with clever, interesting people. Yeah,
and there's enough respect for the ideas. It's like, this might be going too far, Alex, but it's like, what would happen if entire communities, like Christian atheist communities, came into a kind of respectful conversation, and the respect was deep? Like that was the most identifiable attribute for onlookers. What kind of insight would like explode out of that? I think a lot of insight would.
Yeah, the way that I tell, it's all a bit utopian. The quixotic, you might say. The way that I tell if someone respects me is like in their ability to just totally tear down what I'm saying without qualm about upsetting me. It's like I know this person must know me well enough now at this point if they know that I'm not going to be upset by this. Like there are my favorite kind of person. I'm thinking of particular people that I know in person, and what we'll do is we'll have a debate, and it'll be about absolutely anything. It will come out of nowhere. We'll just be debating anything. It could be racial profiling, it could be nuclear weapons or something. And if someone walked into that conversation, they'd think we hate each other. They would really, because they'd walk in and they'd see this person going, that's so like, you know better than this. Like, you've made this point before. You're contradicting yourself. Like, come on, like don't be honest with me. And you'd see me go, yeah, fair enough. I guess you're right. But look, don't be. And it would seem like we're really at each other's throat, right? And then, kind of one of us looks at the watch and goes, "Oh, I've got to go," and immediately you're just like, "Oh, okay, yeah, see you later, man. Like, good to speak to you," and you're friends again, right? Because like like that's kind of what I build friendships on, are those discussions. In fact, I thought about this recently, and I realized that most of the friendships that I have at university are people who I didn't meet by kind of being introduced and saying, "Hi, I'm Alex," and having a bit of small talk. It's people who kind of overheard a conversation I was having and just jumped in,
Yeah.
and then you debate them. And then after you've debated, you go, "Oh, I'm Alex, by the way." And those are the people who've remained my friends.
Yeah.
Because it's a good way to gain respect for someone is to be able to talk about them. That's kind of a sign of respect, as well as a result of respect.
Okay, so we have a series of questions that are all along the same line. I'm trying to find it. I just lost my place. I think I'll be able to find it here in just a minute, though. It had to do with arguments that are well known. Here it is. I found it. It's from Brennan Ho. He says, he or she, and this is for Josh and me, I think, of the well-known philosophical arguments for theism, are there any that you disagree with? And then for Alex, thoughts on Rex Orange County. So I don't know what, maybe that's an inside joke, but let me answer the first question, and then we'll get an answer from Josh, and we'll try to make this quick because we have a couple more questions to get through. So one of the most popular philosophical arguments for theism that I reject are the traditional moral arguments. I don't think that those are persuasive. I do think that moral arguments from knowledge, those are a little bit different. I think that those are persuasive, but the traditional ones, like if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists. I'm not persuaded by that argument, but I am persuaded by the argument for moral knowledge. So, Josh, what are your thoughts? Do you reject any popular arguments?
So I can't see how to get Anselm's original ontological argument to go through without transforming it into something that's now, it's unclear if that has anything to do with his original argument.
I should also mention that the ontological argument I'm completely unpersuaded by as well. So that's another, and I've said that in my interviews on the ontological argument, is that personally I used to think it was a great argument, used to think it was super persuasive, and then I came across the reverse ontological argument, which is sort of what we've talked about today, and I no longer think that it's a very good argument. Now, that's not to say that I couldn't be convinced. Maybe there will be
by these Godelian lines, right?
Perhaps. So if I could even understand them in the Blackwell Companion. Madol, you know who Madol is, right? Yeah, so he has a chapter in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, and it's like I don't even know how many step proof of the ontological argument, but I know that relies on some pretty controversial philosophical principles, and so that was like too difficult for me to even get through. Like the logic in there was literally like it was just using symbolic logic for like 3/4 of it, and I can't read that. So maybe there's something out there that I just can't comprehend personally, and it'll be persuasive, but that's another one that I don't personally find super persuasive. I'm not convinced of it at all.
Yeah, and there are versions of the cosmological argument that I can't see how they go through. So I mean, we could go through a whole list. A lot of it is sort of teasing out inferior forms and then finding the gold, if there is gold.
Mm-hmm. And there's another related question. So before we get into too much detail, we'll just leave it at that. But Alex, what is this Rex Orange County? What's going on with this?
So I don't know if you guys know Rex Orange County. He's a musician. He's quite famous now. I don't know how famous, but the thing I do have to respect Rex Orange County for using a stage name. His real name is Alexander O'Connor, and so if he had decided to use his real name, then I would never come up in a Google search. So I can only thank him for that. Although we do actually have slightly different names, because his name is Alexander O'Connor. My name is just Alex O'Connor. My parents decided not to give me the option of doing the Christopher Hitchens. So probably a good thing, because it would just been another way to copy Christopher Hitchens by insisting that people call me Alexander instead of Alex. I do regret that I don't have the option. It's not the worst circumcision that I could have been given at birth, but it's not the best either.
Here's a question that you may never have been asked before. What is your middle name?
John, unfortunately. I share it with Mr. President.
So you could say John O'Connor if you had to. You could, or AJ O'Connor. I don't know. None of those have the same ring.
When I went by John. I mean, if Alex wasn't kind of bland enough, I'm not sure that John improves things very much. But maybe in a AJ Ayer kind of sense, could go for
You could do Alex J O'Connor. I don't know.
That's what I go by on Twitter. But the main reason for that, a lot of people
Okay.
think that I'm doing that because it's pretentious, because it looks good to have like the J dot. Actually, turns out that if I want to buy alexoconnor.com, it costs me about 10 grand because it's a fairly bland name. If I want to buy alexjoconnor.com, it costs about $10. So, that's the main reason why I started using the J. But now it kind of stuck.
All right, here's the next question, and this is along the same lines, like I said. Josh, what do you think is the strongest rebuttal against your favorite argument for theism? It's a tough one. Alex, what do you think is the strongest argument for theism? So we'll start with Josh.
Well, I'm stuck on what is my favorite argument. I've been thinking a lot about consciousness lately. So people who know me know that I've done a lot of work on contingency arguments. And so you might think that's my favorite argument for theism, but I mean, I've actually been thinking that arguments from consciousness, thinking about this the other day, it's like if you turn on a TV and you see static, and then all of a sudden there's pixels that form into characters, and the characters begin to talk about where do we come from? And it's like, I wouldn't expect that to come from mindlessness, but all the more if they started to have consciousness, like that internal feeling, that subjective feeling. I not only wouldn't expect that, I would sort of find that to be impossible. And so when I think about what it takes for there to be conscious beings who can have these kind of interesting conversations and be part of a story of life with episodes, and to grow into experience tension and trials that lead to potential developments of various kinds, that really convinces me. I mean, and it's not to say the other arguments don't, but it when I see it from sort of certain angles, it's like, oh, like game over, like that's just very clear. But then I guess, to those arguments, the best objections to those would be the kind of dissecting objections that pull each part of that apart and say, okay, well, here's a way in which we can get consciousness, here's a way in which we can get complexity, and then now we have to actually look at each of those dissecting pieces and see if they work. When it comes to my arguments from contingency, I would say the best objections would be ones that probe at the inference from a necessary thing to a supreme thing. And there are lines to fill in that inference, but the best objections, I think the most important objections, are ones that invite that filling in. So that's all I have for now on that.
So Alex, what do you think is the strongest argument for theism?
Well, of course, it depends on exactly what's meant here, because different things are going to work for different people. So if I mean, what do I think is the strongest in terms of, like, if I were arguing the case in front of an audience or something, what would I go for? I think one of the most intuitively strong is the moral argument. I know that you just kind of disparaged it, Cameron, but not in the form that it's presented as you just presented. I get, obviously that's not a very good way of putting it, but I just mean to say the intuition is so strong that there is such thing as morality, and it seems so difficult to ground it without some kind of necessary being, that I understand why there's an intuitive force in the argument that there must be some kind of grounding for it, right? So, like, obviously I'm unconvinced by that because I've had quite extensive discourses on morality, where it might come from, whether or not it exists, and so, like, it doesn't really do it for me because, like, I know what some of the other options are and I've engaged in them and I've got opinions on them. So, but I just mean, generally speaking, I can understand why that might be one of the strongest. For myself, I'm not so much convinced, or I could be convinced by kind of evidential arguments, but it would always have to be a cumulative case, right? An argument for or against something in evidential terms is always going to be kind of, here's something that suggests that it exists, that God exists, here's another thing, and there wouldn't really be one. It would have to be a cumulative case. The only way to say that there was one argument that would, like, have the power to change my mind, for instance, was if it were purely logical, if it were a priori, something like the ontological argument, right? So, like, although obviously I'm not convinced by the ontological argument for the reason that we've spoken about, that has the potential to be the strongest argument, in the sense that if you kind of showed me a version of the ontological argument that I thought was sound and valid, I would have no option but to just go, fair enough, God exists, right? It's like when I was convinced that free will doesn't exist, it was a kind of rational, logical argument that was laid out in front of me, and it was like immediately, because it's just the way I think. If it's laid out in that way, and I think it's sound and valid, then it just has to be true. So I saw it laid out, and immediately I just kind of went, fair enough. Like, that must be true, right? And then you start trying to see if maybe you're wrong that it's sound, maybe it's not valid or something. But, like, I can at least say that if it is sound and valid, then it must be true. There's no way around it. So the strongest argument for me would be a logical a priori one. So if we manage to kind of sort out this asymmetry in the ontological argument, for instance, then it would just necessitate that I believe in God, almost uncontroversially. If it's logically true that God exists, then God exists. Yeah, of course. So that's the kind of thing that would convince me. It wouldn't be an evidential argument, I don't think.
Alex, I'm curious if I may. Have you seen some of these modal cosmological arguments? They're arguments that are a priori from possibility or possible causes, possible explanations, but they're more anchored to the world because they're cosmological arguments. So, for example, it would be something like any contingent state possibly has a cause. Are you familiar with this particular line? Have you seen this before?
I don't think I have, actually.
I think you might. I mean, I can't anticipate. I can't guess.
I'm really sure I'd love it.
But my prediction is that you would enjoy it. You would enjoy thinking it through because of your interest in sort of the abstract lines. And those arguments are ones that I've personally found very compelling. And at least if you're not convinced by them, I'm sure you'll find them interesting.
That would be great, because unlike a lot of atheists, most atheists, at least kind of colleagues of mine, YouTube atheists, for instance, are very strongly in the evidentialist camp. Like when the question is asked, when faced before God, how do you explain yourself? And the Bertrand Russell answer, not enough evidence kind of thing. That's the kind of go-to line, isn't it? It's like, well, there wasn't enough evidence. Well, if I was in front of God, I'd probably say something like, there wasn't enough, sufficient
arguments.
modal reasoning or something. You know what I mean? Like that would really be what it is for me. Like I'd be honest and say that that's more likely to convince me. I'm just saying this so that you're listening.
And then the Lord would say, well done for being intellectually honest. Come with me.
We can only hope. Well, now we're back into Pascal's wager. I think I just say this to listeners, because I'm sure that listeners to this show are generally not like atheist viewers, maybe. That I'm not representative
You'd be surprised.
Of the atheist community in that respect. Well, maybe I don't know, but I'm certainly unique, I think, in that respect, in that most of the people I speak to, it seems at least, are more interested in evidence. Of
an empirical sort.
Yes, I'm more interested in argumentation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe we need to schedule a future conversation on modal cosmological arguments. Maybe we can talk about that. All right, here's another question from Harley Wykes. I think this is her first question, but here it is on the screen. So, Cosmic, Alex, what would you say to someone that believes animal lives are worth less than the human desire to eat them? This has to do with veganism. And then, Josh, do you think rejecting divine simplicity entails atheism like philosopher David B. Hart does?
Bentley Hart, yeah.
Well, the first thing is that they're on the right track here, because a lot of people, the first question they want to ask is, what do you say about people who just don't think animals are worth the same as humans? How can you possibly say animals are worth the same as humans? Of course, I don't think non-human animals, I should say, are worth the same as humans. I just think that they're worth more than human taste buds. So we've at least made that first step of clarification. At least they're being honest. It's not some argument about how non-human animals are worth less because of X and Y reason, because that's fine. That doesn't have anything to do with the argument. At least they're being honest and saying that they think that those animals are just worth less than their taste buds. The question is what I would do, right? What would I say to them? If that kind of person is thinking like that, I would try multiple approaches. But the first thing to do is just swap out the variables and see if it remains the same. So, for example, if I were forcing a pig into a gas chamber because I liked the way it sounded when they squealed for their life, right? If that were my justification, I'd probably sound like a moral monster. It wouldn't be a very morally defensible view for me to torture a pig because I like the way it sounds when they squeal. But sound is just my hearing is just another sense pleasure. So you've got to kind of see what's the difference there between the hearing and the taste, right? But they might just say, actually, yeah, I still agree with that. All of my sensory pleasure is enough of a justification of harm to animals. If that's the case, then
Alex,
did I lose you again?
Yeah, we're having a couple blips here. Maybe repeat. You tried to just keep going. Yeah, let's wait. Maybe I can just filibuster for about 5 more seconds, and then what you can do is
can I just insert something here?
Let's do that. That's actually a good idea.
So my kids, 2 of my kids, they are vegans, and this is not because I sat them down and said, "Oh, you guys, here's my argument for you." It was just them asking, what is this chicken we're eating? Where did it come from? oh, these
Yeah.
are like live animals, and like their own moral intuitions just convince them. And I'll hear them arguing with other friends and even adults defending their case. And for me, like speaking of biases, it's like I've not. I mean, I had orange chicken yesterday, like, and I have arguments against what I did, but I'm like you, Alex. Like, I don't want to believe they're right, but like maybe
Yeah.
they are. I mean, and they have these uncorrupted intuitions. When I say uncorrupted, I mean it's like society hasn't yet buried them with all the reasons why this is just what you do, and they just think it's better not to do it. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So
I mean,
let's get
that's
to.
true. It's
Sorry,
just. Am I back? I can't tell if my internet's still bad.
No, you are back. Yeah, you are
Okay.
back.
I also
I'm trying
can't
to
see you
move
at
it
the
on
moment,
to next. You can't see me.
I can't see you, no.
Oh, okay. Well, everything
I
looks good on my end.
Okay,
So,
that's fine. I just didn't know if that.
I think Alex wanted to kind of
something
finish
that
a
was on
thought,
the other end.
maybe.
I would just add, like, it's a relevant point here that this is just like what we were saying about earlier about smart people believing silly things, right? Because adults are in a position where they can rationalize their beliefs. Children are not, right? We have a lot to learn about the world from the way that children think about it. When you see these cute videos of children finding out where their food comes from and they burst into tears, and people post it on Facebook and all the commenters are saying, oh, and they're laughing and they're saying, look at this, oh, they've got so much to learn about the world. It's like, no, Mr. Commenter, you have so much to learn about the world from these children because they really know what's right here. But what I was going to say is like the other approach to take, if the consistency thing with the different sense pleasures doesn't work, and if you want to be more visceral about it, you can talk about like sexual pleasure. If my sensory pleasure is good enough for me to justify killing and eating the animal, then why is my sexual pleasure not enough to justify sexual intercourse with the animal, right? It seems a bit more grotesque, but it's the same justification. The other thing would then be to say, well, if you think an animal is worth less than a human taste bud, resurrect the evolutionary chain between Homo sapiens and our chimpanzee cousins and all the other animals in the animal kingdom, and find whereabouts it is that you begin to stop caring about their sentience so much that you'd be willing to eat them. So it's either a consistency between the senses or a consistency between the properties of the animals and the humans.
all right. So let's get to another question from Theology Unleashed, and this is a good question. I don't want to end on this one. I have one more that I want to introduce, and sorry for those super chats that we weren't able to get to. We had just too many today to get to, but this one is from Theology Unleashed. He says, it's considered okay to disbelieve something for no good reason, but believing something on intuition alone is considered abominable. Isn't this biased?
Well, I guess it depends on what's motivating the belief. It might be that there is this worry of philosophers that we sort of spin webs of reason and intuition that aren't tethered to reality. And if you see how well science is empirically driven and science works, it gives us technologies. I mean, heck, like we're able to talk with each other this way because of science, the results of science. And so, you might sort of have this suspicion that if somebody just believes something on intuition, then you point to all these false beliefs that intuitions prop up, and it might give you this worry. So I guess, to be honest, like I wouldn't say it has to be based purely on bias. I think it could be motivated. On the other hand, I mean, I would be a big defender of intuition as a source of true beliefs. In fact, all logic and mathematics is ultimately rooted in some basic intuition. Science itself has in its foundation logic. Like let's say you do an experiment and you have some data that supports T. Now you could infer, well, maybe T and not T. Well, you're not going to do that because you have this a priori intuition that that's not the best explanation of the data. So I would definitely defend intuitions as a reliable source, but I don't think it has to be based on bias, though it could be a sign of bias for sure.
I think there's a notion of the burden of proof that needs to be clarified here. If you disbelieve something for no good reason, well, you don't need a good reason to disbelieve something. I mean, disbelieving is a suspension of belief, and you don't need to justify that suspension. You might need to justify your rejection of arguments in favor of something if they're strong enough. I had a conversation about this with somebody once who just kind of asked me the question, do you not think that there are some beliefs, some disbeliefs that do require a burden of proof because they're just so ridiculous? Like if somebody didn't believe their parents existed or that they didn't have parents, even though that they were right there, like They could just say, well, I'm just unconvinced that I have parents. And you could say, but look, I mean, here are your parents. They're literally in front of you. And they say, well, I'm just unconvinced by that. It seems intuitive that actually they do need to do some proving or some justification for their beliefs, right? Technically, if they have genuinely suspended their beliefs, then they don't have a burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the other person. The question is whether the burden of proof has been met by the other person. And there might be a justification needed to present why those arguments are being rejected. But just the idea of kind of not believing something, of suspending belief, doesn't require good reason at all. Whereas believing something, actually putting forward a proposition and putting your weight behind it, does require justification. And that's why we need to ask the question, is intuition a good enough reason to justify it? That's why the question makes sense for believing something, but not for suspending belief in something.
Suspending. I mean, disbelieving might be sort of ambiguous between not believing versus believing not.
Yeah, that's the only ambiguity. If you mean to say that it's okay to believe something is not the case with no good reason, then I'd simply disagree with you. That's not okay. If you believe something is not the case, if you're making a negative existential claim, it's like, yeah, you better have some justification for that.
All right, so we're nearing the end today, and I wanted to bring in one more question here. I think it's an interesting question from Matt Cooper. He says, by the way, thank you for the super chat. He says, great discussion. Curious what all of you think about David Wood's approach to these kinds of conversations. Are you guys familiar with David Wood?
Somewhat. Mm-hmm. Not intimately.
Okay. So I actually just did an in-person interview with him. Well, I did the in-person interview back in August, but it's just sent out to my patrons as of right now. I think it actually was posted during the conversation. I had it on schedule. Anyways, so I'm going to talk about some of my personal interactions with him. He said, let me finish the comment here. He says, seems very different from the collaborative truth-seeking approach being considered here. He's talking about David Wood's approach. Mm-hmm. So when you watch his videos, he is very combative in a lot of ways. And we talk about that in the interview that we do. He's mainly, his apologetic ministry and everything, Acts 17 apologetics, is mainly targeted to Muslims. So he's targeting them, trying to give reasons, arguments against Islam. And so he does this in a way that is very provocative. It's very combative. And he defends that in this interview by saying that basically it's the only way to persuade them, because a lot of them, the culture, in our American culture, it's a lot different. And so he uses this, it's almost like a utilitarian argument. Like, this is the best way to get the best result for the most people, is this approach. And so that's the reasoning behind it. And so I'll say that. You can think whatever you want to think about that, but that's his reasoning behind it. And you can watch the interview if you want to see more about what he thinks. And you may actually change your mind after you listen to him talk about it. But I've noticed, because I've had personal conversations with him. I met him for the first time when we actually did the in-person interview. And so I had a conversation with him. The conversation that I had with him was really good. And I've had conversations with him about philosophy, just other topics. And I found that he could jump in this conversation right now and it would be almost exactly like what we're doing right here. So I think that there's a difference between like what you see on his YouTube channel, which is kind of like polemics. It's kind of like, it's almost like acting, basically, where he's trying to do one thing with that YouTube channel, which is to convert Muslims to Christianity. And so he takes on almost like a different persona in order to reach that goal. But I think that just in conversations that I've had with him, I've noticed that it's a completely different scenario. It's almost like a different person. When I've talked to him, it's just like a normal guy who reasons and talks, and it's just like the conversation that we're having here. So anyways, I just wanted to, that's something that probably not a lot of people know, and I didn't know that until I actually sat down and talked to him. But do you guys have any thoughts about like a sort of combative approach like that versus an approach that we're taking here? And then after that, we're going to wrap it up.
Do you have something, Alex?
I would just say both are probably necessary. This will be the last time, because it's the last opportunity, but I'd try and make it the last time anyway, that I'll bring up veganism. But the same kind of thing applies here, right? It's like, look, I'm convinced that there's this moral absurdity going on, this abomination. It's like, all I want to do is go and shout at people on the street about it, right? But the question is this going to be a useful strategy? And the answer, disappointingly, is sometimes. Like it depends. If I'm giving a speech in front of an audience of mostly meat eaters, then maybe I'll be polemic. Maybe I'll, slam my hand on the podium and make a strong case. But like afterwards, if a timid 14-year-old comes up to me and says, I'm confused. I didn't understand the point about this. For me to turn around and go, yeah, typical, you don't understand. I can't believe that people just can't get it into their head that that would just be ridiculous, right? I would probably sit down and say, well, hey, let's talk it out, man. Like, let's go through the premises. Like, why is it that suffering is bad, generally speaking, and you talk it out. But if I was at the podium, for me to kind of go, so why is it that suffering's bad? It's like, it wouldn't have the same kind of effect. So, both are necessary. But I don't know about David Wood specifically. I'm certainly familiar with him, but I'm not particularly familiar with his content. It's not something I watch regularly, but I can understand why the decorum would change depending on the target audience.
Yeah, I just want to echo the principle. So I kind of first discovered this when I was having a conversation with somebody. I guess I can be specific. It was Jehovah's Witnesses came to the door. And it was one of those conversations where, like, okay, come on in, like, let's talk. And we met with them for maybe half a year, kind of working through the ideas. And my style was collaborative, like we're just truth seeking together. And it seemed like that wasn't like effective to helping them to kind of think or to sort of see things in a new way for themselves, because they were more authority driven. And I remember being kind of stunned when one day I actually went to their Kingdom Hall and was like talking with people afterwards and having conversations. And I said just authoritatively that, I wasn't like unkind about it, but just that I just disagreed. And it was so like, I didn't expect it, but it's almost like they responded in a way that seemed like they actually respected that. And it was like it was more than that they respected. It was like they were moved by it. Like it actually shook them. It actually changed the nature of the conversation. And I realized, oh, okay, so for them, appealing to principles of reason or this kind of, let's try to find out what's true. Like, let's really think this through. It's like that they were more authority driven. It's like, okay, the Watchtower says this is how we interpret this text. And that actually helped me to realize just kind of what you guys are saying is that, like, you use different tools for different purposes and for different audiences. And the tools you might use in one playground aren't going to be effective or helpful even. It won't serve people in another playground. I think for this reason, sometimes it can be easy to kind of draw a circle around your own favorite tools and sort of think, oh, I've got the best way of doing it. And then these other people are just like not doing it. But I do see value in different ways of doing it. I feel like my strength isn't in a kind of rhetorical attack or something like this, or a rhetorical demonstration, but more in let's think this through together. Like that's kind of my strength. So I would sort of lean into my strengths and let other people lean into their strengths. That isn't to say that there aren't universal principles. Like I do think that there is this one constraint I think everybody should go by, which is to always see other people with value. I think that's a very helpful constraint no matter what your approach is. Seeing other people with value, that's like an ethical principle. I think it's true. So you should use that in any context.
Well, I really appreciate you guys coming on the show today. It was a lot of fun, and this is a bit unusual. There were a lot of people in the comments as I was reading them coming in saying, this is not, I was expecting a debate. I was expecting them to disagree about something. There's too much agreement here.
Okay, next time we'll debate the modal cosmological argument. And we'll come with different tools, with a different energy.
Yeah, well, like I said, I appreciate you guys coming on. It's been a lot of fun, and yeah, maybe we can throw this new discussion together fairly quickly. I don't know. We'll have to see what everyone's schedule looks like. But again, thanks for coming on, guys. It's been awesome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Likewise, as always. Cheers.
All right, so if you guys want to become a supporter of Capturing Christianity, you can go to, let me actually pull up my banner here, patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. That's the way to do it. So I appreciate you if you want to support this ministry and help maintain the videos that are popping out as often as 2 or 3 times a week, which is actually sort of a record that we're setting now. It's like at least 3 videos a week pretty much for the last few weeks since this pandemic sort of broke out. So if you want to continue and help this ministry stay afloat, then patreon.com/Capturing Christianity is the way to do it. You can actually gain access to a private Facebook group called The Bereans, where we have awesome chats and share a lot of cool things in there. So anyways, thank you guys for watching today, and we'll see you later. So peace.